Dear God, how many times are we going to do this? Every offseason? Really? Every single one? Please, please, please stop acting like DeMarcus Cousins is like the best player in the world or was. It's driving me nuts. Before I get into this video, if you have been enjoying it, please be sure to subscribe. I'm going to be uploading 3 days a week over on this channel for the foreseeable future. Also, drop a like. It only takes 1 second, and it makes a massive difference in how the video performs in the YouTube algorithm, so it is much appreciated. The NBA offseason has officially hit the real dead period. There's a part towards the start of the offseason that's not great, but then you get stuff like Dame asking out of Portland, and that's exciting. But we're at the point where there's just nothing going on. So whenever that happens, you can expect generic Twitter posts meant to get as much engagement as you can while nothing is going on. A lot of these posts you know well. There's the classic start bench cut. 9 times out of 10, I find that one of those 3 players in those was basically set up to fail because the other 2 are obviously better. There's Jason Williams highlights. Those are super popular. I feel like we're officially removed from the man, Melo should still be in the league post, but those were always fun. But the one post that inevitably comes for some reason is a post about DeMarcus Cousins and how, if you really think about it, he's actually the best big man who ever walked the earth. And you look at the comments, you look at those quote tweets, and you slowly realize that there is a genuinely significant number of people who actually believe that DeMarcus Cousins was on the same level as Joel Embiid and Nikola Jokic. And worse, some even go as far as to say that DeMarcus was better. And if you're looking at DeMarcus objectively without rose-tinted glasses, you can see that this is just a ludicrous take. It is dumb in every conceivable fashion. Now I want to make something really clear right from the jump. I really liked DeMarcus Cousins back in his prime. He was pretty popular and pretty big right as I was getting into basketball. He's kind of one of the first guys I saw make that real ascension, and I liked him. I especially liked him on the New Orleans Pelicans and was really excited for what him and Anthony Davis would look like as a duo. Obviously, that was unfortunately cut short. DeMarcus was a super likable dude on top of the fact that he was a really fun basketball player to watch. I found him particularly likable because he's the type of guy that weird, annoying, conservative NBA fans act like isn't a likable guy. So that just inherently made me like him more. However, with that said, I have this extraordinarily annoying thing with my brain that also happens to have worked out to be a career, but that thing is when I see a bunch of people who, in my mind, are just very clearly wrong, I can't let it go. I have to talk about it. It drives me nuts if I don't. And a take like DeMarcus Cousins is as good or better than Joel Embiid, that's just wrong. It just is, and it drives me insane that anyone would think otherwise. And I think it is especially disrespectful as hell to Joel Embiid and especially Nikola Jokic to suggest that DeMarcus was on their level. So I suppose the best way to go about this would just go beat by beat, skill set by skill set, and compare what DeMarcus could do versus what Embiid and Jokic can do. Let's start where DeMarcus Cousins is at his best, scoring the ball. I do believe DeMarcus probably didn't get enough credit in his time for being such a good mix of power and finesse as a big man. He was someone who could put your ass in the basket, but also pull off an up and under or hit a face-up jumper or even take it off of the dribble with regularity. DeMarcus had a well-rounded scoring bag. You really had to play him at all 3 levels, at least to some extent, after he started shooting threes, although it was a short period of time where he was really getting those up before his career ended. Also, given how physical he was, he got to the line quite a bit, which as much as people who like to piss their pants about James Harden or Dwayne Wade's '06 finals, that's a really important part of scoring. So that frequency at the line was a huge part of his game. But with these positives in mind, I do want to point out that his efficiency left some room to be desired. In his 5-year peak, he had a true shooting percentage of just 55%, which of course is right around league average. He shot not very great from the line, not disastrous, but it's worse than you would think. Also, as it turns out, his jump shot actually wasn't great. It definitely seemed like it was going in more than it was. Again, looking at that 5-year peak, from 10 to 16 feet, he shot 35%. And from 16 feet to just inside the three-point line, he shot 38%, both of which were below league average percentages. And his three-ball volume was pretty good for how out of nowhere it kind of was. And in his peak shooting season, the year he was traded to the Pelicans and the season following that, before he tore his Achilles, in those 2 years, he shot 36% from three on 5.5 attempts, which is pretty good. But all things considered, DeMarcus Cousins was not an amazing jump shooter as a whole. But that's not even the worst of it, because not only could the guy not make a jump shot, but he was also not as strong of a finisher in the paint as you might think. Again, looking at that 5-year peak, he shot 62% at the rim, which is not exactly dominant for a big man. It's not bad per se, but it's not as high as you would like. Now, let's look at some of these shooting numbers with Embiid and Jokic's to contrast. At the rim, Embiid shoots 76% in his 5-year peak. Jokic shoots 74.5%. On jumpers from 10 to 16 feet, Embiid shoots 45%. Jokic shoots 50%. On jumpers from 16 feet to just inside the line, Embiid shoots 43.6% and Jokic shoots 46%. On free throws, Embiid and Jokic both shoot 83%. And looking at overall true shooting, Embiid is at 62% and Jokic is at 64%. The only area of the floor where Cousins is not notably less efficient than Embiid and Jokic is from the three-point line, and that is a marginal difference. Now, okay, sure, Embiid and Jokic are more efficient, but who cares about that dork shit? Let's talk about points per game. That's what hoops is really about. Well, in that case, DeMarcus Cousins in that peak averaged 25.2 points. Jokic averages 23.5. Though I do want to point out, if we're comparing true peaks and going like last 2 years, Nikola Jokic, last 3 years, he's at 26 points per game, so just bear that in mind. And Joel Embiid, over his last 5 years, averages 28.8 points per game. So Embiid scores more, Jokic scores slightly less over the last 5 seasons, but more over his last 3, while having a 10% better true shooting percentage. And Embiid averages 3.5 more points, and he did it much more efficiently. So both of them are better scorers, period. I'm not going to hear an argument otherwise. They're just better. It's not a debate. So here comes the problem for DeMarcus. What exactly does that leave for him to be better than these guys at? Really, the only thing I can think of that he has an edge on either side here is playmaking. Now, obviously, I'm not talking about Jokic. I don't need to explain to you that Jokic is a better playmaker than DeMarcus Cousins, but I do think to some extent DeMarcus's playmaking was a little underrated, and if there's anything that the Sacramento Kings did wrong, well, that's a bad way to phrase it. There's a lot of things the Sacramento Kings did wrong, but I think one of the big ones was that they didn't take more advantage of the fact that DeMarcus was as gifted of a playmaker as he was as a center. That's something that the Pelicans actually did quite a bit, especially given that he had Anthony Davis as a target. And in his final season with them, the season he tore his Achilles, he averaged 5 assists a game, which is pretty damn good for a 5. Joel Embiid can struggle with his playmaking. His assist numbers are fine, but he especially struggles to deal with double teams and making the right decision under pressure. So I will give the edge to DeMarcus over Embiid as a playmaker, although that's really the only edge he's going to get. So that is not much, all things considered. Then we get to rebounding. Obviously, that is a huge part about being a big man, but between the three of them, they all average 11 point something rebounds per game. Boogie grabs 11.9, Embiid grabs 11.6, Jokic grabs 11.4. I'm not going to argue about who's a better rebounder over a 0.5 per game difference. It's a marginal difference one way or the other, who cares? But with that in mind, now let's talk about defense. Yeah. Joel Embiid is at worst a top 15 defender in the NBA, so we can move on from there. And as for Jokic, obviously the narrative for him has been that he's some traffic cone on defense, but he pretty much destroyed that narrative with this postseason, where he was one of the best defenders in the entire postseason. He was the anchor of a Denver defense that was very pivotal in their dominant championship run. DeMarcus, by contrast, I do feel is treated as a little bit more of a garbage defender than he truly was. Don't get me wrong, he wasn't good, but I feel like people talk about him like he's Enes Kanter bad, and that wasn't true. He did a good job of getting counting stats. He was particularly good at stealing the ball as a big man, which is not that common, not as many blocks as steals for him, which is interesting, but ultimately not a good defender, man. Just a bad defender. I would say Jokic is a good defender, Embiid is an excellent one, and DeMarcus Cousins is a bad defender. Now let's talk about winning. Now that's obviously the most contextual thing here, and I'll be the first to tell you that the Sacramento Kings, the roster that they put around DeMarcus throughout his career, was not good. And of course, the only time he had a very good teammate was Anthony Davis, and he tore his Achilles before he could finally make the playoffs for the first time with him. That said, DeMarcus, of course, never made the playoffs in Sacramento, and there are a lot of factors outside of his control that caused that. However, I feel like people treat it as though just because those factors exist, that entirely excuses missing the playoffs, especially to the significant degree that DeMarcus did. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't actually believe that DeMarcus should have made the playoffs with those teams, and I'm not holding it against him. However, I will hold it against him, and I will knock him for it if we're saying that he's better than Jokic and Embiid. Here's the difference. When you're on the level of a Nikola Jokic and Joel Embiid, and you play 65 games or more, you're pretty much guaranteed to make the NBA playoffs because having someone of that talent just gets you there. Joel Embiid, before they traded for Harden, and obviously while Ben Simmons was not playing, had the Sixers on a 50-win pace. He hasn't really experienced playing with absolutely no help much in his career, but the one limited sample we got, the Sixers looked really good in the regular season and were well on their way to a playoff spot. And of course, Nikola Jokic has won 2 MVPs on complete garbage teams that he dragged to the playoffs. There are plenty of teams that DeMarcus had around him that Embiid and Jokic would have been able to get into a playoff spot just because they're MVP caliber players, and DeMarcus Cousins was not. Rudy Gay, Rajon Rondo, Darren Collison, and Omari Caspi is not a significantly worse 4 best teammates than 2 years ago Aaron Gordon, Monte Morris, Will Barton, and Jeff Green. With those 4 players, Jokic won 48. With the 4 DeMarcus had, he got to 33. Now, you might say, to be fair to DeMarcus, he did deal with some injury stuff, and maybe that's why they didn't make the playoffs, but that's also not really true. The closest they got was that 33-win season that I previously mentioned. That year, he played 65 games, but in the 17 games that he missed, if you apply the same win percentage that they had with DeMarcus that season in the games that he played, they would only subsequently win 3 to 4 more games when they were 9 wins away from making the playoffs. Again, That is as close as they got. So even if you got 82 games of DeMarcus Cousins, he's not giving you a level of production that is going to get you a spot in the playoffs. The Kings did not miss the playoffs every year because they had some generational talent that they did not put good enough teammates around. They missed the playoffs because they had a pretty damn good player who was just not a franchise #1 guy like they thought he was. And then, of course, the mid-ass talent around him was not helping anything. So if DeMarcus is a worse scorer than Embiid and Jokic, basically the same as a rebounder, a much worse playmaker than Nikola Jokic, but of course a decent bit better than Embiid there, but then obviously a significantly worse defender than both, and all while he did not win in spite of mid-talent as Embiid and especially Jokic have done. If all of that true, which it's as close to objective that it is, then please explain to me how this is a conversation at all. Please explain to me how DeMarcus Cousins is on the same level as these two MVP players. Please, I'm waiting for the answer because the stats don't back it up. The winning isn't there. The eye test doesn't back it up either. So don't give me that fucking argument. And if you're trying to make a two-way argument, well, DeMarcus is losing that. Where is this argument other than people looking at this through the lens of nostalgia? The reason why this happens is there is unfortunately a very large section of the NBA fandom that just perpetually acts as though former players are just like inherently better than today's players. Once a player is no longer actually in the league today, said player is assigned a level of like mysticism to them, and they are thus elevated above what they were considered to be. And as a result, they are elevated above what they were considered to be before in their time, and they thus stand on this level that current players are essentially playing catch up to get to. DeMarcus is solidified in history, and therefore he is apparently just on a plane above Jokic and Embiid, but that's not how it works. Both of them are way better players than DeMarcus Cousins ever was. Both of them rank much higher all time than DeMarcus Cousins does. And just because, I'll say this, just because DeMarcus Cousins should have played more seasons in his career, it doesn't mean that the player that he was before, therefore, was better than he actually was. I don't know if this even makes sense to y'all, but it definitely does to me, at least I think. It's looking at the past with these rose-tinted glasses, and it's ironic that I'm saying rose-tinted glasses because the same thing happens with Derrick Rose, but that's a whole other conversation. Anyways, I think I've made my point. I'm sorry to say negative things about DeMarcus. Again, I don't want to, but let's be real here. Let's not be disrespectful to Embiid and especially Nikola Jokic to compare him to somebody who probably isn't much better than Bam Adebayo. Anyways, shout out to Rudy for editing this video, and goodbye.